Richie Merzian is Climate and Energy Director at the Australia Institute. He's in Glasgow for the summit. He says the event needs to focus on major emissions cuts by 2030.
Well, I mean, that's the homework for Glasgow. It's to increase those 2030 targets. The whole point is that we're revisiting the Paris Agreement 6 years ago, seeing if we're doing enough. And the answer from the UN, from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is no. Collectively, we're falling short, and countries are asked to bring forward fresh, updated, stronger targets. We've seen a lot more action from the US, UK, EU, Japan, Canada, even recently New Zealand. Unfortunately, not Australia. And so that gap remains. Hopefully some of that will close at this particular meeting. That's certainly the UK's ambition.
But Australia has made that commitment for net zero emissions by 2050, which it hasn't been able to get the Nationals over the line on that before. So do you give the Liberal Party some credit for that?
I mean, net zero by 2050 is kind of like the participation reward. It doesn't really get you much credit, certainly not here in Glasgow, where over 100 leaders are coming. The majority have committed to net zero by 2050, and the focus is clearly on the short-term impact. And the President Biden has said this is the decisive decade. That's what's being asked of countries. It's to have an immediate impact on our climate because we're collectively failing. And unfortunately, that's what's really going to get you credit. Australia's plan on net zero by 2050 allows fossil fuels to flourish, and so it will be seen as fraudulent because it's actually allowing more emissions in the short term rather than starting to scale them down.
You said more than 100 leaders are in Glasgow, but there are some significant emissions, aren't there? China, the world's largest emitter, won't be there in person. Russia, one of the world's biggest energy producers, their leader won't be there either. And India, even though Narendra Modi is in attendance, it has not committed to net zero emissions by 2050.
Look, it is disappointing that you're not seeing all the G20 leaders come. And, notably, the UN climate chief said in her opening comments today when the COP26 kicked off that every country needs to bring more, especially the high emitters in the G20, responsible for 80% of global emissions. But the interesting thing is, where is Australia placed in the G20 right now? All its allies and friends, the member of the G7 countries, they've all increased their short-term targets. They've committed to net zero by 2050, and they're all talking about phasing out coal power. Australia, by not bringing more on the table in the short term, is actually giving cover to the other laggards in the G20. This is a consensus process, and so ultimately, if you drag your heels, you bring everyone down, and that's how Australia is being perceived, certainly by its friends that have all done more.
Yeah, well, the Australian government would point to the fact that it will exceed its pledge of 26 to 28% carbon reduction emissions by 2030. So how was it able to do that? And what more would you like to see them do?
Yeah, look, it's great that Australia can meet and beat its target. So lock in a new target if the first one was so easy to accomplish. Because if you look closely at how they did that, most of that comes from changes to land use, which is sort of as a consequence of state government policy, not federal government policy. What has happened over the last 15 years is that the energy sector has become more carbon intensive. In fact, we're using more fossil fuels, not less. So really, if the Australian government wants to put more on the table, or at least get credit for meeting and beating, then lock in a fresh, new, ambitious target. Australia's target was similar to the US, and now the US has doubled their efforts. They will halve emissions by 2030, the same target the New South Wales government has locked itself into as well. So if it is so easy to meet and beat, then increase your ambition and put that on the table, because that's what's really the purpose of Glasgow and COP26.
Yeah, do you think that a significant agreement can and will be made? The G20, which just met, which discussed climate change heavily, came up with only mild pledges on carbon neutrality.
Yeah, look, it's a real risk that COP26 doesn't achieve what it's supposed to do, which is to close that emissions gap, to get more collective action on the table. The UK is doing everything it can, and the UK has smaller emissions than Australia, and Australia has, less than half the population, and yet the UK is going far and out to try and push for everyone to do more and is reducing its emissions 68% over the next decade. Look, there is a real risk that things might fall over. And if that is the case, then Australia might end up sharing the blame for not actually helping to drive that ambition.
Richie Merzian, it's pretty remarkable that you're actually in Glasgow for these climate talks. Just talk us through the process of getting there.
Yeah, look, it was a long journey to actually find your way onto a plane leaving the country. There was permissions that you needed to get from the Department of Home Affairs. There were obviously your vaccine you had to get along with certification. You had to do a test right before you left. And most importantly, you needed to find a flight back, which was so limited when those caps were in place in Sydney and in Melbourne, and now they're slowly starting to loosen. So it does feel otherworldly to finally leave the country. But when you get here, you realize that the rest of the world is getting on with it, and climate change is just as important as it's always been. And that's what we've seen across the board. The Climate of the Nation 2021 has found that 75% of Australians are concerned about climate change. It hasn't dipped over the pandemic, and you can see why the issue is just as urgent.
The bottom 20% get nothing. They're really unfair tax cuts.
People want to see much stronger action from the government when it comes to climate change.
It's no coincidence that we have a wages crisis in Australia.
Transitioning to net zero emissions, it doesn't seem like there's much room for gas.